The year was drawing to a close. 1944 bled into its final frigid weeks. Across the battered landscape of Europe, the relentless cacophony of war, the thunderous echoes of tank treads and artillery barrages which had defined the preceding months, began, almost imperceptibly, to abate. The Allied armies, buoyed by their triumphant sweeping advance following the breakout from the hedgerow-tangled fields of Normandy, were now consolidating their gains, edging ever closer to the borders of the German heartland, a creeping, inexorable tide. They paused, catching their breath, steeling themselves for the final decisive push. The Wehrmacht, once a juggernaut of unparalleled military might, now staggered, wounded and weary, a beast brought low. Morale, that intangible yet vital ingredient of any fighting force, was crumbling. Equipment was stretched thin, and manpower reserves were dwindling at an alarming rate. For the Allied forces, victory, final and complete, appeared tantalizingly close, a matter of weeks, perhaps months. Yet, within the crumbling edifice of the Third Reich, one man remained defiant, his will unbent, his resolve hardened by delusion and desperation: Adolf Hitler. Ignoring the increasingly urgent pleas of his senior commanders, men who urged him to husband his remaining resources, to fortify the German defences and prepare for the inevitable invasion, the Führer clung to a vision of salvation, a last desperate gamble. He would unleash one final devastating offensive, a blow so audacious, so unexpected, that it would shatter the Allied advance and snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. December 15th slipped into the history books, cloaked in an eerie calm. The Allied troops, many of them young, inexperienced, and lulled into a false sense of security by the recent lull in fighting, remained blissfully unaware of the impending storm. Only the day before, with characteristic bravado, 21st Army Group Commander Bernard Montgomery had issued a confident pronouncement. Words that would soon ring hollow in the ears of those who heard them, words that betrayed a fatal underestimation of the enemy's remaining strength. The inadequacies of German manpower, equipment, and resources preclude any offensive action on their part, he declared, his voice brimming with assurance, a statement that reflected not reality, but wishful thinking. A dangerous complacency settled over the front lines, a deceptive calm before the hurricane. The young soldiers dreamt of home, of Christmas, of lives resuming their normalcy. But their world was about to be ripped apart, torn asunder by the fury of a desperate cornered foe. Like a tempest unleashed, a surge of pent-up rage and destruction, a surprised German force was poised to descend upon the unsuspecting American troops stationed in the Ardennes forest. The sheer scale of the attack, the overwhelming numbers of the German divisions, the relentless momentum of the assault would give the impression that they had materialized from thin air, a phantom army conjured from the depths of Germany's wounded pride. This was to be no mere skirmish. This was a blitzkrieg reborn, a lightning strike designed to cleave the Allied lines and plunge the region into chaos. The unyielding German advance, the bulge it created in the Allied front, would consume the Ardennes. Towns and villages would fall, and the American defences would crumble under the sheer weight of the onslaught. Yet, even amidst the maelstrom of destruction, a spark of defiance flickered. A beacon of resistance ignited deep within the frozen woodlands of Belgium. On the strategically important, yet seemingly unremarkable, Lanzerath Ridge, Lieutenant Lyle Buck Jr. and his small band of 18 men stood their ground, refusing to yield. These American warriors, outnumbered and outgunned, would be forced to hold their position against an entire German battalion, a force numbering over 500 soldiers. Their courage, their tenacity, their unwavering commitment to duty would become a testament to the indomitable spirit of the American soldier. If they succeeded, if they held the line against overwhelming odds, their actions could threaten to unravel Hitler's grand design, to disrupt the German offensive and send shockwaves that would reverberate throughout the remainder of the war. A last violent gasp, a turning of the tide in a sea of desperation. The crushing defeat at Stalingrad, a cataclysmic blow that marked the turning point on the Eastern Front, had left the German war machine reeling. The seemingly endless reserves of the Soviet Union, fueled by a burning thirst for retribution, advanced relentlessly westward, an unstoppable tide of iron and blood. By the latter months of 1944, Hitler was forced to confront the stark reality that Berlin, his capital, the symbolic heart of the Third Reich, would soon fall prey to the Soviet onslaught. Unless, by some stroke of strategic genius, German forces could be redeployed from the Western Front to bolster the crumbling defences in the East. However, the situation in the West was scarcely less perilous. The formidable Allied armies, comprised of British, American, and Canadian forces, stood poised on the very doorstep of Germany, their tanks rumbling, their artillery primed, ready to unleash the final assault. They had executed a masterful breakout from Normandy, shattering the German lines and driving them eastward in a series of hard-fought battles. Yet, in Hitler's warped and increasingly detached mind, these Allied forces were, perhaps, more vulnerable to fracture than the seemingly monolithic Red Army. The German dictator, blinded by his own propaganda and fueled by an unwavering belief in his own infallibility, perceived the alliance between Britain and the United States as tenuous, a fragile bond that could be severed with a single, decisive blow. He was convinced that a successful offensive, a crushing defeat inflicted upon the Allied forces in the West, could coax America into negotiating a peace settlement, a desperate attempt to break the Allied coalition. This, in turn, would enable Germany to concentrate its remaining forces on repelling the Soviet threat, a last-ditch effort to stave off total defeat. But the odds were stacked against Germany. The situation was dire, the resources depleted, the manpower dwindling, and the equipment battered and worn. Launching a sudden, large-scale offensive strike would be a monumental challenge. It would demand the total, unreserved commitment of every remaining German soldier on the Western Front, a risky gamble with potentially catastrophic consequences. The battle plan, meticulously crafted in the war rooms of Berlin, was audacious in its scope and ambition. Hitler would resurrect the tactics that had served him so well 4 years earlier, unleashing a lightning-fast assault through the dense forests of the Ardennes, employing his most formidable armoured formation, the 6th Panzer Army. The German forces would punch through the American lines in the Ardennes, ford the treacherous river Meuse, and then capture the strategically vital port city of Antwerp, cleaving the Allied front in two and forcing the Allies into a desperate situation, a scenario reminiscent of the chaotic evacuation at Dunkirk. The daring gambit teetered on a razor's edge. Success would deliver a crushing, humiliating blow to the Allies, forcing them to re-evaluate their commitment to the war and potentially opening the door to a negotiated peace. Failure, however, would completely squander the Wehrmacht's last remnants of strength, leaving them vulnerable to an unstoppable Allied invasion of Germany, exposing the Reich to the full fury of its enemies. Hitler, never one to shy away from risk, didn't hesitate. He didn't toy with the idea of adopting a defensive posture, a more prudent and arguably more realistic strategy. Instead, with all his chips on the table, he unleashed the full fury of the Ardennes offensive, a desperate gamble that would become known to the Allies as the Battle of the Bulge. The element of surprise was paramount to the success of the Ardennes offensive. Without it, the entire operation would be doomed to failure. The Allied forces needed to be thoroughly convinced that the German army was incapable of launching a major attack, that they were too weak, too disorganized, too demoralized to mount any significant offensive action. The illusion of German weakness had to be meticulously cultivated, maintained, and reinforced. To achieve this, the German military embarked on a massive deception operation, mobilizing hundreds of thousands of men in complete secrecy. They stealthily traversed the dense forests of the Ardennes under the cloak of darkness, moving like shadows through the trees, their presence concealed from prying eyes. By day, They sought refuge in local villages and towns, seeking temporary sanctuary amidst the unsuspecting civilian population, stowing their vehicles in barns or skillfully camouflaging them with foliage, concealing them from aerial reconnaissance. Allied warplanes, constantly scouring the countryside in search of enemy activity, would see no evidence of a burgeoning enemy force, no telltale signs of a major troop build-up. Unbeknownst to the vast majority of the German soldiers, they were mere pawns in a top-secret operation, the details of which were withheld even from the regimental commanders until the 11th hour. Only the uppermost echelon of the German command structure was privy to the full scope of the offensive. A select few officers who gathered in hushed war rooms, poring over maps and charts, meticulously planning every detail of the assault. Even then, numerous high-ranking officers, seasoned veterans of countless battles, cautiously counselled Hitler to reconsider his plan, to devote what remained of their troops and dwindling resources to the defence of Germany, to fortify the borders and prepare for the inevitable Allied invasion. But by this stage of the war, Hitler had long ago stopped pretending to listen to the advice of his generals. He dismissed their concerns as defeatist and ignored their warnings, convinced that his own strategic genius would prevail. As the principal attack force covertly assembled in the Ardennes, Otto Skorzeny, a notorious German SS commando, famed for his daring rescue of Benito Mussolini a year prior, led a covert operation behind enemy lines, a mission of audacious deception known as Operation Grief. Skorzeny and his team of specially trained operatives, fluent in English and meticulously disguised as US and British soldiers, infiltrated Allied territory, their objective to sow chaos and confusion in the crucial hours preceding the attack. These English-speaking German agents wreaked havoc on the Allies, sabotaging supply lines, cutting communication cables, and tampering with signposts, misdirecting traffic and sowing confusion amongst the Allied ranks. They spread false rumours, disrupted logistical operations, and generally attempted to destabilise the Allied war effort from within, a campaign of insidious sabotage. The group even managed to divert an entire Allied regiment off course, leading them away from a critical sector of the front lines, a successful act of deception that would have far-reaching consequences. Simultaneously, another special operations group executed Operation Stöße, a daring nighttime paratroop drop behind Allied lines. Their mission was to capture a vital road junction near Malmedy in Belgium, a strategically important crossroads that controlled access to key routes through the Ardennes. The paratroopers, under the command of Colonel Haight, were tasked with seizing and holding the junction, disrupting Allied traffic and paving the way for the advancing German armour. A bold and risky operation that would test their skills and courage to the limit. The secrecy surrounding the overall German deployment proved remarkably successful in deceiving the Allies, lulling them into a false sense of security. Allied intelligence agencies failed to connect the dots, failing to recognise the coordinated nature of the German special operations. The rapid mobilisation, carried out under strained conditions and with limited resources, pushed the Wehrmacht supply lines to the breaking point, stretching them thin and testing their logistical capabilities. But it was now or never. The die was cast and the fate of the Reich hung in the balance. As German forces, both within and beyond the Allied lines, readied themselves for the onslaught, the unsuspecting American and British troops remained oblivious to the imminent storm. They spent their days in relative peace, repairing equipment, writing letters home, and dreaming of Christmas. On the morning of December 16th, 1944, the German army was given the go-ahead to unleash what it hoped would be a final, devastating blitzkrieg upon Europe, a desperate attempt to reverse the tide of the war and secure a lasting victory for the Third Reich. The stage was set for a battle that would test the courage, resilience, and resolve of all those involved. In the pre-dawn hours of December 16th, the dreaded 6th Panzer Army, commanded by the infamous Sepp Dietrich, a staunch Nazi ideologue known for his ruthlessness and unwavering loyalty to Hitler, launched a vicious and unanticipated attack against unsuspecting US positions. their tanks churning through the snow-covered landscape, their guns blazing, their infantry advancing in waves. The assault caught countless American soldiers completely off guard. Many were still in their tents, enjoying a rare moment of rest, when the thunderous roar of artillery and the relentless rattle of machine gun fire shattered the morning calm. They scrambled frantically to grab their rifles and equipment, desperately trying to organize a defense as German tanks mercilessly overwhelmed their positions. The element of surprise had been devastatingly effective. Defying Hitler's explicit orders to initiate the attack with a colossal artillery barrage, a tactic designed to soften up the enemy defences and create a path for the advancing armour, Hasso von Manteuffel, the commander of the 5th Panzer Army, opted for a stealthier approach, a more subtle and calculated manoeuvre. He silently crossed the Sauer River under cover of darkness, hoping to surprise the slumbering Americans and catch them completely unprepared. His gamble paid off. The abrupt and brutal onslaught sent many newer US recruits into a state of sheer panic. Some fled in abject terror, abandoning their positions and seeking refuge in the surrounding forests, while others, according to eyewitness accounts, were reduced to cowering in fear, unable to react to the sudden and overwhelming onslaught. In an instant, the front lines along the Ardennes had been transformed into a feverish nightmare for the woefully unprepared Allies. The peace and tranquility of the previous weeks had been shattered, replaced by the deafening roar of battle and the chilling realization that they were facing a powerful and determined enemy. The Germans achieved immediate and resounding victories, smashing one Allied position after another and skillfully penetrating deep into French and Belgian territory, their tanks and infantry advancing with relentless speed and determination. This rapid advance, covering nearly 60 miles in the first few days of the offensive, gave rise to the infamous German Bulge in the front lines, a salient that jutted deep into Allied territory, signalling the onset of an arduous and harrowing struggle for all involved. The Battle of the Bulge had begun, and the outcome remained uncertain. However, not all Allied combatants were fresh to the front lines. Not all succumbed to fear and panic. Amid the chaos and destruction, a select few American soldiers demonstrated unwavering courage and resilience. They stood their ground, fought with tenacity, and refused to yield to the overwhelming odds. In the ensuing hours, their extraordinary bravery and determination would earn them an enduring place in the annals of military history. Their names would be etched in the memories of future generations as symbols of courage, sacrifice, and the indomitable spirit of the American soldier. The fighting was fierce, the stakes were high, and the outcome of the battle would ultimately determine the fate of Europe. The 18 American servicemen of the 394th Intelligence and Reconnaissance Platoon were an elite, albeit somewhat inexperienced cadre deployed to the treacherous Ardennes. This was no ordinary unit. They were selected for their intelligence and aptitude rather than their combat experience. Among them were college-educated graduates of the now-defunct Army Specialized Training Program, an initiative designed to prepare future personnel in specialized fields such as engineering, foreign languages, and medicine, skills that were deemed essential for the war effort. The program had been abruptly terminated due to manpower shortages, and its graduates were hastily reassigned to combat units. Commanding the platoon was one of the youngest officers in the entire army, the 20-year-old prodigy, Lieutenant Lyle Book Jr. A natural leader with a keen intellect and a deep sense of responsibility, Book was determined to lead his men with courage and competence, despite his relative inexperience. Comprising 2 reconnaissance squads, each with 9 men, the platoon was highly trained for surveillance efforts. They were experts in gathering intelligence, observing enemy movements, and reporting their findings to higher headquarters. However, they were ill-equipped for direct engagement with the Germans. Their training had focused on observation and reconnaissance, not on close-quarters combat. Their primary objective was to act as a specialized intelligence unit, collecting information on enemy coordinates and size and relaying it to the regimental intelligence officer. They were the eyes and ears of the 394th Infantry Regiment. They operated patrol vehicles, manned observation posts, and coordinated intelligence activities across the regiment to accomplish this vital task. Stationed in a brick building in Hunningen in Belgium, near the German border, they utilised the basement as a storage facility for military combat rations, a valuable resource in the event of a prolonged engagement. On the fateful morning of December 16th, the two squadrons detected a formidable German advance in the neighbouring town. The Americans were effectively cut off, with communications to higher headquarters severely disrupted and additional support nowhere in sight. They were isolated and vulnerable, surrounded by a rapidly advancing enemy force. At the time, most American forces in the area were focused on assaulting the Siegfried Line through Wallerscheid, a mere 5 miles north of the platoon's position. Although they anticipated a counterattack, the sheer magnitude of the German force far exceeded their wildest expectations. Previous reports by the military brass had depicted the Wehrmacht as being in shambles, weakened and demoralised. As the vast horde marched towards the US lines, the GIs could not comprehend where the massive formations had come from. It seemed impossible that the German army could have amassed such a large force without detection. Undaunted by the overwhelming odds, Lieutenant Buch and his team resolved to establish fortifications at Lanzerath, atop a hill nestled on the forest's edge, overlooking a vast expanse of pasture. This strategic location offered a commanding view of the surrounding terrain and provided a natural defensive position. It was the ideal place to make a stand. Capitalizing on the remnants of foxholes left by a previous unit, they dug deeper, enlarging the spaces to accommodate additional soldiers. Concealed beneath pine logs, their position commanded a 300-yard stretch of the ridgeline to the northeast, providing them with a clear vantage point over the fork in the road to their left. As snow fell, the Americans seamlessly blended into their surroundings, hidden from the prying eyes of the enemy below. They were masters of camouflage, able to disappear into the landscape. They utilised a nearby log hut as a warming shelter, providing a temporary respite from the bitter cold, and armed themselves with an impressive arsenal secured by Buch, which included additional carbines, automatic rifles, and a light machine gun. A .50 caliber machine gun mounted on a jeep, also obtained through Buch's ingenuity, completed their brawny cache, providing them with significant firepower. The platoon meticulously positioned the jeep, ensuring it held a strategic advantage over the road, with hourly jeep patrols to maintain contact between the flanks and monitor enemy movements. The team that had been intended to serve as the eyes and ears of the 394th Infantry Regiment was thrust into a role for which they were scarcely prepared. They were now the first line of defence against a massive German offensive. Their new and sole directive was to hold the area at all costs, to delay the German advance and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. They clung to the hope that help would soon be on its way, that they would not be left to face the overwhelming German force alone. Buch would later recount in an interview, "We weren't trained to occupy a defensive position in the front lines. We were trained to patrol and get information about the enemy. Yet they would now have to go above and beyond, to summon every ounce of courage, skill and determination to hold their ground against the onslaught." As the Americans braced themselves for the inevitable onslaught, on the other side of the battlefield, the German 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment prepared to accomplish their mission, to spearhead the advance of the 6th Panzer Army by assaulting the village of Lanzerath and razing it to the ground, clearing the way for the armoured divisions to advance towards their objectives. German commanders, eager to conserve their valuable armour vehicles for tougher battles ahead, deemed the infantry of the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment more than capable of taking the small village that stood in their way and weeding out any isolated American units in the area. They underestimated the resolve of the American defenders. By that point in the war, most German units were composed of a mix of seasoned veterans, battle-hardened soldiers who had seen action on multiple fronts, and a large number of untested young men who had barely any experience with firearms. a reflection of the dwindling manpower reserves of the Third Reich. During the invasion of Normandy, the German 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, known for its effectiveness in combat and its unwavering commitment to duty, had been severely depleted. Suffering heavy casualties in the fierce fighting, it had been rebuilt with members from Luftwaffe field regiments, airmen who had been hastily retrained as infantry soldiers to maintain German morale and bolster the ranks of the dwindling Fallschirmjäger. These new recruits were equipped with advanced weaponry, including the G44 selective fire rifle, a revolutionary assault rifle that offered a significant advantage in firepower, rifle grenades, and various other armaments. However, despite their modern equipment, they were still green and inexperienced, lacking the combat skills and battlefield awareness of the veteran Fallschirmjäger. Furthermore, thanks to Nazi Germany's unwavering propaganda machine, they were under the impression that the American soldiers were highly demoralized and unwilling to put up a fight. A dangerous misconception that would prove costly. From this reformed 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division, the 9th Regiment was tasked with leading the attack on Lanzerath and clearing the village of any resistance. They would then proceed to attack the towns of Honsfeld and Bullingen, where they believed they would face the bulk of the US troops. These towns were strategically important for controlling key roads and supply routes. The 6th Panzer Army, spearheaded by Kampfgruppe Piper, a powerful armoured battle group under the command of the ruthless SS Standartenführer Joachim Piper, was to follow up immediately, attacking along the route by Lossheimer Graben directly after Lanzerath had been taken. Their objective to break through the American lines and advance towards the Meuse River. Despite Germany's recent losses and the fact that they were being crushed by foreign armies on two fronts, the morale of these German servicemen remained surprisingly strong. They were fueled by a potent mixture of patriotism, propaganda, and a deep-seated fear of the consequences of defeat. They saw themselves as the ultimate defence of their homeland and were prepared to fight tooth and nail to protect it from the advancing Allied armies. The letters the German soldiers wrote home at the time revealed a surprising sense of optimism and determination. They believed victory was still possible and perceived their advance as unstoppable. The German forces advanced through the heavily wooded areas surrounding Lanzerath, their boots crunching through the snow-covered ground. The 500 men from the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment and 50 from the Fusilier Regiment marched forward, utterly unaware of the tiny American platoon about to make their lives a living hell. They were confident in their numbers and their superior firepower, but they had no idea what awaited them on the Lanzerath Ridge. As the 9th Fallschirmjäger Regiment advanced toward the outnumbered American platoon, they knew the might of the forces that marched behind them. Over 500,000 troops, 1,400 tanks, and 2,400 warplanes were now moving to unleash the wrath of the Third Reich one last time, a desperate attempt to turn the tide of the war. It had been years since most German troops had witnessed a German offensive of such scope. They were intoxicated by the idea that this was the moment for them to reverse the course of the war in their favour and continue the dream of the 1,000-year Reich, a vision of German dominance that had fueled the conflict. Little did they know that they were about to be punished by fewer than 24 American soldiers, a small but determined force that would defy the odds and hold their ground against overwhelming numbers. The stage was set for a clash that would become a testament to courage, resilience, and the unwavering spirit of the American soldier. The ominous rumble of a 2-hour-long rolling barrage signalled the beginning of the attack. The earth trembled beneath the feet of the American defenders. Huddled in their foxholes, the INR platoon braced for impact, gritting their teeth as the artillery shells rained down around them. The noise was deafening, and the ground shook violently. Miraculously, the foxholes provided just enough protection, and the platoon emerged mostly unscathed. Their well-dug positions had saved them from the worst of the bombardment. However, their reprieve was short-lived. As they discovered that the German artillery fire had severed their landlines, leaving them isolated and unable to call for backup, they were cut off from the outside world. Desperate for information, the regiment radioed orders for the platoon to hold their position and send out a patrol. They needed to know what was happening on the front lines. As the patrol crept through the shattered landscape, they watched in horror as a massive German infantry formation advanced under the glow of giant searchlights near Losheim. The scale of the enemy force was overwhelming. As dawn broke, Buch spotted a long column of around 500 German troops marching towards them. 18 men against 500! It was ludicrous, a David and Goliath scenario that seemed impossible to overcome. Buch contacted regimental headquarters to request permission to withdraw and engage in a delaying action. It seemed suicidal to try and hold their ground against such overwhelming odds. However, he was instructed to hold their position at all costs and wait for reinforcements from the 3rd Battalion. He had no choice but to obey the orders. German soldiers continued to advance, and Buch sent some of his men to assist in various defensive and observational positions, reinforcing their defences and preparing for the inevitable attack. Skirmishes erupted around the village of Lanzerath, with the American soldiers engaging in close combat with the advancing German forces. The fighting was fierce and desperate. The passionate German troopers, fueled by propaganda and a belief in their own invincibility, were highly inexperienced and overconfident. Their reckless zeal would soon make them pay. In one instance, Krieger, an American soldier, single-handedly engaged and neutralized most of a German platoon by himself, using the .50 caliber machine gun mounted on the jeep. His accurate and sustained fire decimated the enemy ranks. At their ridgetop position, Buch and his platoon prepared to surprise the German forces as they advanced. They had meticulously planned their defence, hoping to inflict heavy casualties on the enemy. However, a young girl from the village of Lanzerath unknowingly alerted the Germans to the Americans' presence. Her innocent actions had inadvertently compromised their position. The Germans immediately took cover, and a fierce firefight ensued between the outnumbered American platoon and the advancing German infantry. The air filled with the crackle of gunfire and the thud of bullets hitting the ground. Discovered and significantly outgunned, the Americans dug into their reinforced positions. They placed their hopes on their experience and the rehearsed routine they had meticulously devised. As the freezing skirmish devolved into one blistering gust of bullets after another, the American soldiers were taken aback by the inexperienced tactics employed by the German troops as they charged head-on and bunched together in the open, making themselves easy targets. Some of the Americans would later claim it was similar to shooting clay ducks in California at an amusement park. The German soldiers seemed to be charging blindly into the line of fire. Several Germans were cut down trying to climb over the 4-feet-high barbed wire fence that divided the field. Their bodies lay scattered across the snow-covered ground. As German casualties mounted, the Americans allowed German medics to remove the wounded under a white flag. A brief moment of humanity amidst the carnage of war. But they soon resumed fire after noticing suspicious activity. The Germans were attempting to use the opportunity to scout their positions. The American platoon fiercely defended their position throughout the day, inflicting humiliating losses on the German forces. Their accurate fire and well-prepared defences proved to be a formidable obstacle. The deep foxholes and the heavy snow that had fallen during the night made the American position mostly invisible to the Germans. They knew where the fire was coming from, but could not effectively strike back. Lieutenant Buch was determined to fight to the last bullet, even as the ominous threat of the 1st SS Panzer Division loomed. He knew that if they failed to hold their position, the German armour would pour through the gap in the lines and advance towards its objectives. But the enemy's relentless fire eventually took its toll,